Good evening to you from Vienna, where Radio 3's Danube week is now in full swing. Tonight we're going to do what's obligatory for any self-respecting, music-loving visitor to this great city. We're going to the opera. Richard Strauss's Ariadne auf Naxos is on the bill tonight at the Vienna State Opera, with editor Gruberova, Susan Graham and Deborah Voigt among the divas on parade. Ariadne is a happy blend of comedy and grand opera, describing what happens when the richest man in 18th century Vienna coolly informs the two groups of performers waiting to entertain him, one an opera company with a brand new work, the other a commedia dell'arte troupe, that in order to speed things up and be finished in time for the fireworks at 9 o'clock, the two shows must be given simultaneously rather than one after the other. It's an intriguing recipe for a merry musical mix-up. But let's begin at the beginning with the opera house itself. It's one of Vienna's great landmarks, situated in the heart of the city known as the Ring, the tree-lined boulevard which was created in the 1860s by the Emperor Franz Joseph on the land where once the ramparts of the old city had withstood Turkish invasions one after another. The Opera House, with its Renaissance-style facade, was a potent symbol of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire's prosperity, but it was destroyed by American Air Force bombs in 1945, less than 2 months before the end of the war. 10 years later, it reopened with a performance of Fidelio. Our interval feature tonight will give you a lot more background into the history of the place, but for the moment we must hasten upstairs so as not to be late for the performance. Well, I doubt whether there's a grander entrance hall in the world than that of the Vienna State Opera. It's all of 3 stories high, you realize, as you crane your neck up to take it all in, and a veritable marvel of marble and gold leaf and chandeliers. Directly in front of us is a superb staircase, arching up left and right to the second-floor galleries. If you're sitting in the stalls in the parterre, you go straight ahead. But if you're placed higher up in the auditorium, as I am tonight, you have to mount these stairs, and I tell you, you feel like a grandee of some kind. The front-of-house part of this building survived the 1945 bombing, thank goodness, though I expect the Vienna State Opera is the sort of place that Pierre Boulez must have had in mind all those years ago when he said he wanted to see all the opera houses burnt down. It's positively reeking with privilege, but hang on, wait a minute, that's a bit of a cliché, I have to admit. My ticket may have cost £80, much less, incidentally, than the price for a good seat at the Royal Opera before its unhappy closure, but there are actually 567 cheap places every night for standees, compared with 1,642 seats at various prices. They play to full houses every night here, and there's quite a crush already as I push my way into the big foyer on the first floor. It's such an elegant space, and strictly no smoking, I'm glad to observe. This spacious room, which overlooks the Ringstrasse, also survives from the original 1860s architecture, and it's gorgeous. High ceiling, heavily decorated, a wooden parquet floor, very creaky, and plaster busts of the leading composers of the day placed in niches high up on the walls. A bronze bust of Gustav Mahler is placed on a mantelpiece at one end of the long room. Mahler, a Jew who notoriously became a Catholic in order to get the job, was music director here from 1897 to 1907. Over 10 years, he set standards in ensemble, in choice of singers and in design, which have never been surpassed. Nobody in the 20th century could match Mahler's achievement, but the long wall in this foyer does have busts of 3 of Mahler's conductor's successors. There's Clemens Krauss on the left, who saw the opera company through its darkest days during the war. And then further along, bang in the middle of this room, a bust of the Salzburg-born Herbert von Karajan, whose conducting genius hit Vienna with gale force in the late 50s. I remember hearing him conduct a magnificent Walküre on my first visit here in 1957. And last on this side of the room, there's a bust of Karl Böhm. He was briefly the intendant when the new house opened in 1955, and he was a very frequent opera conductor thereafter. But now here's the bronze bust that's most relevant for today's visit. It's at the far end of the room from Mahler, but it looks across towards his old friend, a portrait bust of Richard Strauss, dating, I should think, from about the time he served briefly here as intendant in the 1920s. Strauss's opera, Ariadne auf Naxos, dates from the previous decade. Premiered in its original form in Stuttgart in 1912, it was seen for the first time in the familiar version we'll be hearing tonight in October 1916 in this very house, which was then the Viennese court opera. The first half of the opera, the prologue, is set backstage at a rich man's private theatre sometime in the middle 18th century. A troupe of commedia dell'arte strolling players are practicing their acts, while an opera company is busy assembling to perform a new opera, Ariadne. Its young composer is nervously pacing the boards, hoping for a final rehearsal with the violins. Well, let's take this as a cue to go backstage ourselves for a moment to meet that young composer in the person of the American mezzo-soprano Susan Graham. May I come in?
Hi.
Hi, it's not your quiet time or anything.
Quiet time? The Vienna State Opera? Is there such a thing as quiet time backstage?
Well, that's of course what Strauss was depicting in the first scene we're going to be seeing.
Oh, he makes it very clear, and he has a quite accurate representation, I think.
What kind of a character, though, is the composer? You tell us in your...
Oh, well, I think he's a young man who is very excited and full of the love of the art and that what he's trying to create, and he wants everyone to be just as excited about it as he is, of course. And quickly he realizes that it's not all a happy scene, and that art making and music making is not always as sort of joyous and happy colored as he may want it to be, and he sees sort of the seamier side of it all suddenly, and he a certain amount of cynicism then creeps in, but he's very ardent about his message and his mission.
Composers are usually renowned, like Mozart, for falling in love with their prima donnas, their sort of top sopranos, but you fall in love with the dancing girl, Zerbinetta, who in a sense is going to sabotage the production, isn't she?
Oh, against his will, you know. Sometimes we always go for the ones which we just shouldn't, but it seems kind of, you know, the Komponist is not immune to that little foible.
It's a tremendous tradition you're singing in. Lotte Lehmann sang this role here in 1916.
Thank you for telling me that right before I go on stage, Humphrey. That's very assuring.
It's a tremendous role, but it's also inspired Strauss to write some of his most moving and beautiful music, doesn't it?
Oh, it's, you know, this week at the Wiener State Opera I have sung Rosenkavalier and Ariadne, and you know, I think I can die happy now. To sing both of these incredible roles in 1 week in Vienna is really, really a thrill. He's a master, of course, of writing for women's voices, and it's very moving, and he captures that ardent fervor of the composer so much, and how the composer just will turn on a dime, you know, like adolescent boys tend to do, and even some more grown-up boys tend to turn on a dime, and grown-up girls too. But you know, he captures these mood changes so beautifully, from fury to ardor to love to passion to frustration, everything.
Susan Graham talking in her dressing room about her role as the composer in the prologue to Strauss's opera Ariadne auf Naxos. Well, I've moved into the auditorium of the Vienna State Opera now. It's a relatively austere theatre space built in the early 1950s. The traditional horseshoe shape was retained from the original building, and 3 rows of boxes decorated in gold and cream rise up vertically from the stalls with 2 galleries above. It's fun to sit up here in the box, but it's not particularly comfortable, I must admit, since many of the seats require you to sit at a slightly awkward angle. I rather envy the standees just below me down here in this very full house. Well, Ariadne auf Naxos is one of the most popular operas in the Viennese repertoire. Since the premiere in 1916, there have been well over 400 performances in this theatre. This production is by Filippo San Just. It's 22 years old and still looking very handsome. The proportions of the opera are slightly lopsided. There's a 40-minute prologue, then the interval, and then the one-act opera, just under an hour and a half in length. The prologue is hustle and bustle from the start, cross-cutting between different groups of characters at the pace of a feature film. So I won't attempt to summarize all the twists and turns of the action. The essential point to grasp is that there are two sets of performers in residence backstage at the private theatre of the richest man in Vienna. One is a troupe of Italian clowns and the other is an opera company. Both have been hired to perform for his lordship on the same evening. The master's commands are relayed to the performers by his major domo, Herr Hofmeister. This is a speaking role taken tonight by the veteran tenor Waldemar Kmentt. Now early on, the major domo confirms the running order for the evening. First on the bill, there's to be the new opera, ARIADNE AUF NAXOS. Its youthful composer is present, still coming up with new musical ideas and frustrated in his desire to have a last-minute rehearsal. That's the role taken by Susan Graham, the trousers role. And the composer's chief supporter is his music teacher, sung tonight by the baritone Peter Weber. Following the serious opera, there's to be the light relief, an opera buffa, provided by a quartet of Italian commedia dell'arte players, whose leader is the delicious Zerbinetta, sung tonight by the coloratura soprano Edita Gruberova. She's a huge favorite here with the Viennese. Other theatre types include the dancing master, who's the spokesman for the clowns, and the wig maker. The prima donna in the opera, sung tonight by Deborah Voigt, makes a typically prima donna-ish entrance, and we hear the star tenor complaining about the miserable laurel wreath that he's been given to wear in his forthcoming operatic role of Bacchus. He's sung by Janez Lotric. An officer leaves after an assignation with the vigorously flirtatious Zerbinetta in her dressing room, and then the composer, in the midst of all his worries, starts to fall in love with Zerbinetta, despite the fact that he's convinced that her vulgar show will ruin the effect of his new opera. Now, you can't miss the bombshell announced by the major domo when he returns halfway through the prologue. Cancel all previous plans, he says. His noble lord has now decided that so as to have his fireworks display start punctually at 9, the two entertainments must be given not consecutively as planned, but simultaneously, gleichzeitig. The news is greeted by shock horror in the opera seria camp, but by a willingness to compromise from the comedians. The tenor suggests cuts in the prima donna's part. Equally treacherous, the prima donna urges cuts in what the tenor sings. The composer overhears Zerbinetta giving her colleagues a plot summary of the opera, and he begins to argue with her about the nature of Ariadne's love. And now the frantic tempo slows down as Zerbinetta sets out to charm the composer. She can never stop flirting. She convinces him of the futility of putting idealism before reality, and they sing an increasingly tender duet, after which the composer launches into an ecstatic paean of praise to the holy art of music, giving the final movements of the prologue a mood of rapture that ranks high among the great moments of lyric opera. Now, the lights are beginning to darken now, beautiful as the chandeliers and the candelabra dim slowly, and we're waiting for tonight's conductor, Peter Schneider. The members of the Vienna State Opera Orchestra in the Peter Small Orchestra, a fascinating orchestra, two harps, piano, harmonium amongst the orchestration. That marvelous breathless hush when everybody's waiting, everybody's taking their seats. And now here's Peter Schneider to conduct the prologue to Ariadne auf Naxos.
ganzen Hause.
Womit kann ich dienen? Muss allerdings bemerken, dass ich pressiert bin. Die Vorbereitungen zur heutigen großen Assemblée im Hause des reichsten Mannes von Wien, wie ich meinen gnädigen Herrn wohl betiteln darf.
Ein Wort nur. Ich höre soeben, was ich allerdings nicht begreifen kann.
Und das wäre?
Und was mich in erklärliche Aufregung versetzt.
In Kürze, wenn ich bitten darf.
Dass bei der heutigen festlichen Veranstaltung hier im Palais nach der Opera Seria meines Schülers kaum trau ich meinen Ohren noch eine weitere, und zwar gleichfalls sozusagen musikalische Darbietung in Aussicht genommen ist, eine Art von Singspiel oder niedrige Posse in der italienischen Buffo-Manier. Das kann nicht geschehen.
Kann nicht, wieso?
Darf nicht.
Wie beliebt?
Das wird der Komponist nie und nimmer gestatten.
Wer wird? Ich höre gestatten. Ich wüsste nicht, wer außer meinem gnädigen Herrn, in dessen Palais Sie sich befinden und Ihre Kunstfertigkeiten heute zu produzieren die Ehre haben, etwas zu gestatten, geschweige denn anzuordnen hätte.
Es ist wieder die Verabredung. Die Opera Seria Ariadne wurde eigens für diese festliche Veranstaltung komponiert.
Und das ausbedungene Honorar wird nebst einer munifizenten Gratifikation durch meine Hand in die ihrige gelangen.
Ich zweifle nicht an der Zahlungsfähigkeit eines steinreichen Mannes,
für den Sie samt Ihrem Eleven Ihre Notenarbeit zu liefern, die Auszeichnung hatten. Was dann steht noch zu Diensten?
Diese Notenarbeit ist ein ernstes, bedeutendes Werk. Es kann uns nicht gleichgültig sein, in welchem Rahmen dieses dargestellt wird.
Jedennoch bleibt es meinem gnädigen Herrn summo et unico loco überlassen, welche Arten von Spektakel er seinen hochansehnlichen Gästen nach Vorsetzung einer feierlichen Kollation zu bieten gesonnen ist.
Zu diesen die Verdauung fördernden Rechts demnach die heroische Oper Ariadne.
Aha, zuvörderst diese, danach das für Punkt 9 Uhr anbefohlene Feuerwerk und zwischen beiden die eingeschobene Opera Buffa, womit ich die Ehre habe, mich zu empfehlen.
Wie soll ich das meinem Schüler beibringen? Wir finden euer Gnade, Mademoiselle Zerbinetta. Sie ist bei der Toilette. Ich werde anklopfen. Lasse das sein, gehe zum Teufel! Das ist die Sprache der Leidenschaft, verbunden mit einem unrichtigen Objekt. Die Geigen werden schwerlich kommen. Erstens weiß keine Füße nicht an und zweitens weiß sie in der Hand sind.
Wenn ich sage, die Geigen, so meine ich die Spieler.
Ach so, die sind aber jetzt dort, wo ich auch hin sollt und wo ich gleich sein werd, anstatt mich da mit ihnen aufzuhalten.
Wo ist das?
Bei der Tafel.
Jetzt? Eine Viertelstunde vor Anfang meiner Oper beim Essen.
Wenn ich sag bei der Tafel, so meine ich natürlich bei der herrschaftlichen Tafel, nicht beim Musikantentisch.
Was soll das heißen?
Aufspielen tun sie. Capito sind also für Sie derzeit nicht zu sprechen.
So werde ich mit der Demoiselle die Arie der Ariadne repetieren.
Hier ist nicht die Demoiselle drin, die Sie suchen. Diejenige Demoiselle aber, die hier drin ist für Sie ebenfalls nicht zu sprechen.
Weiß er, wer ich bin, wer in meiner Oper singt, für mich jederzeit zu sprechen.
Bacchus, das Meer auszusetzen wurde dazu. Da hat der Luft für seinen Bacchus kommt.
Mein Wertester, Sie alle dringendst muss ich sprechen.
Deren missfälliges Betragen kann ich belächeln, nur eine angeborene Gemütsaufwallung zu rechnen.
Mein Wertester!
Habe meinerseits keine Ursache, wegen meiner Leistungen vor Ihnen zu erröten.
Hat der Herr leicht ein Stück Schreibpapier? Er hätte mir gern was aufnotiert. Ich vergesse nämlich gar leicht.
Kann nicht dienen.
Erst nach Hochkommen wieder. Es sind kleine Lehrkosten, die Herrschaften wieder zu machen, wenn sie sich erst eine Weile gelangweilt haben. Oder meinen Sie, es wird mit der Dinge? Schnell, lieber Freund, eine Beklei zu mir! Ich muss unbedingt sofort den Grafen sprechen!
Du kannst jetzt nicht eintreten. Sieh dich beim Frisieren.
Wer ist dieses Mädchen?
Sie werden leichtes Spiel haben, Mademoiselle. Sei sie
wird
wird
so
langweilig über die Begriffe und was die Einfälle anlangt. So steckt in meinem linken Schuhabsatz mehr Melodie, als in dieser ganzen Ariadne auf Naxos.
Wer ist dieses entzückende Mädchen?
Umso besser, wenn sie dir gefällt. Es ist die Zervinetta. Sie singt und tanzt mit 4 Partnern das lustige Nachspiel, das man nach deiner Oper gibt.
Nach meiner Oper! Ein lustiges Nachspiel, Tänzer, Tränen, frische Gebärden und zweite Reden, nach Ariadne. Sag mir's,
Ich bitte dich um alles.
das Geheimnis des Lebens tritt an Sie heran. Nimm sie bei der Hand und sie bestimmt mich eine Stücke Notenpapier. Meine rote Freunde, ist meine Spiegel, meine Rot, meine Kraft. Und du hast es gewusst.
Mein Freund, ich bin halt 30 Jahre älter als du und hab halt gelernt, mich in die Welt zu schicken.
Wer so an mir handelt, der ist mein Freund gewesen. Haben Sie nach dem Traffic geschickt? Ui, was gibt's denn da für Scheingeld? Uns mit dieser Sorte verleiten eine Topf. Weiß man hier nicht, wer ich bin? Wie konnte der Graf so in so langweilig ist? Dann hätte man doch Angst, erst auf der Welt lassen. Mit unser Hügel und Spiegel haben sie sich erst eine Stunde gelitten. So ist es nicht schwer, sie Gegenteil, man kommt vom Tisch, man ist bestehrt und weniger aufgelegt. Man macht unbemerkte Schläfchen, klatscht an das Höflichkeit und um sich Macht zu machen. Indessen ist man ganz munter geworden. Was kommt jetzt, sagt man sie? Die ungetreue Zerbinette und ihre 4 Liebhaber, ein heiteres Nachspiel mit Tänzen, leichte gefällige Melodien, ja eine Handlung, klar wie der Tag. Da weiß man, woran man ist, das ist unser Fall. Sagt man sich, da wacht man auf, da ist meine Sache. Und wie sie in ihren Karossen sitzen, wissen sie überhaupt nichts mehr, als dass sie die unvergleichliche Terminetta am Tag
erzürnet sie sich nicht, nichts und wieder nichts. Ariadne ist das Ereignis des Abends, Ariadne zu hören, versammeln sich Tenor und vornehme Personen im Hause des reichen Mäzens. Ariadne ist das Losungswort, sie sind Ariadne und morgen wird überhaupt niemand mehr wissen, das ist außer Ariadne und etwas gewinnt. Die Herrschaften stehen vom Tisch auf, man sollte sich hier beeilen, meine Damen und Herren in den Plätzen.
Ihnen allen habe ich eine plötzliche Anordnung meines gnädigen Herrn auszurichten.
Ist schon geschehen. Wir sind bereit, in 3 Minuten mit der Oper Ariadne anzufangen.
Der gnädige Herr haben sich nunmehr wiederum anders besonnen.
Es soll also nicht mit der Oper begonnen werden.
Was ist das?
Um Vergebung. Wo ist der Herr Tanzmeister?
Was wünscht man von mir?
Ich habe einen Auftrag meines gnädigen Herrn für Sie beide. Mein gnädiger Herr belieben das von ihm selbst genehmigte Programm umzustoßen.
Jetzt, im letzten Moment, das ist doch ein starkes Stück.
Umzustoßen und folgendermaßen abzuändern.
Das Nachspiel wird Vorspiel. Wir geben zuerst die ungetreue Terminetta, dann Ariadne sehr vernünftig.
Um Vergebung, die Tanzmaskerade wird weder als Nachspiel noch als Vorspiel aufgeführt, sondern mit dem Trauerstück Ariadne gleichzeitig.
Ist dieser reiche Herr besessen? Will er sich über uns lustig machen?
Sind die Leute wahnsinnig? Ich muss augenblicklich den Grafen sprechen.
Es ist genauso, wie ich es sage. Wie Sie es machen werden, das ist natürlich Ihre Sache.
Unsere Sache?
Mein gnädiger Herr ist der für Sie schmeichelhaften Meinung, dass Sie beide Ihr Handwerk genug verstehen, um eine solche kleine Änderung auf 1-2 durchzuführen. Es ist nun einmal der Wille meines gnädigen Herrn, die beiden Stücke, das Lustige und das Traurige, mit allen Personen und der richtigen Musik, so wie er sie bestellt und bezahlt hat, gleichzeitig auf seiner Bühne serviert zu bekommen.
Warum gleichzeitig?
Und zwar so, dass die ganze Vorstellung deswegen auch nicht einen Moment länger dauert. Denn für Punkt 9 Uhr ist ein Feuerwerk im Garten anbefohlen.
Ja, wie um aller Götter willen stellt sich denn seine Gnaden das vor?
Eine innere Stimme hat mir von der Wege an etwas derartiges vorausgesagt.
Es ist wohl nicht die Sache meines gnädigen Herrn, wenn er ein Spektakel bezahlt, sich auch noch damit abzugeben, wie es ausgeführt werden soll. Seine Gnaden ist gewöhnt anzuordnen und seine Anordnungen befolgt zu sehen. Zudem ist mein gnädiger Herr schon seit 3 Tagen ungehalten darüber, dass in einem so wohl ausgestatteten Hause wie das seinige ein so jämmerlicher Schauplatz dargestellt wird wie eine wüste Insel und ist eben, um dem abzuhelfen, auf den sublimen Gedanken gekommen, diese wüste Insel durch das Personal aus dem anderen Stück einigermaßen anständig staffieren zu lassen.
Das finde ich sehr richtig. Es gibt nichts Geschmackloseres als eine wüste Insel.
Ariadne auf Naxos her! Sie ist das Sinnbild der menschlichen Einsamkeit.
Eben darum braucht sie Gesellschaft.
Nicht unsicher ist das Meer, die Steine, die Bäume, das harmlose Echo. Sieht sie ein menschliches Gesicht, wird meine Musik sinnlos.
Aber der Zuhörer unterhält sie, so wie es jetzt so ist es umstehend einzuschlafen.
Um Vergebung, aber ich bitte sich höflich zu beeilen. Die Herrschaften werden sogleich eintreten.
Ich weiß nicht, wo mir der Kopf steht, wenn man 2 Stunden Zeit hätte, um über die Lösung nachzudenken.
Darüber wirst du nachdenken, wo menschliche Gemeinheit stirbt die Medusa, eine mit Gegenfrist.
Was wir hier verloren haben, die 50 Dukaten unter anderem, von denen du das nächste halbe Jahr zu leben gedachtest.
Ich habe nichts mit dieser Welt gemein. Lebe ihr!
Ich weiß wirklich nicht, warum sie beide einem so vernünftigen Vorschlag solch übertriebene Schwierigkeiten entgegensetzen. Meinen Sie im Ernst, es ließe sich machen? Nicht leichter als etwas. Die Oper enthält Längen, gefährliche Längen. Man lässt sie weg hört, wie geht er selbst war.
Fragen Sie ihn, ob er seine Oper lieber heute ein wenig verstimmt hören will, oder ob er sie niemals hören will. Schaffe sie ihm Tinte, Federn, Rotstift, was immer. Es handelt sich darum, gehört und der große Meister, die wir auf den Knien bewundern, haben ihre erste Aufführung mit noch ganz anderen Opfern erkauft. Meinen Sie, hat er recht? Muss ich denn? Sehen Sie zu, dass er genug reicht. Ich rufe indes Zerbinetta. Wir erklären ihr 2 Worte die Handlung. Sie ist eine Meisterin im Improvisieren. Da sie immer nur sich selber spielt, findet sie sich in jeder Situation zurecht. Die anderen sind auf sie eingespielt. Es wird alles wie am Schnürchen. Der Mann bis er sich reißt.
Sieht so, dass für den Bacchus einiges vergeht. Aber treibt es nicht. Diese
Diese Frau, unerhörlich auf der Bühne stehen, nimmt ihr 2 Arien weg, ihnen keine Note, verraten Sie mich nicht. Ihr nimmt den Bacchus die alte
Lage, ist meine Königstochter,
das ist die Geschichte
eine
des
Gewinn, ein Kies, nimmt sie vorher das Leben gerettet hat. Wie soll es mir wieder überdrüssig und nicht zu mein Mord, aber auf einer Wiese nie, sein Turin.
Doch das es muss sein.
Sie verzehrt sich in Sehnsucht und hüpft den Tod herbei. Natürlich, so kommt's ja auch. Mein Herr, so kommt es nicht. Denn Herr ist ein von der Frau, die nur einem Leben gehört.
Sie vermuten ganz recht, es ist der jugendliche Gott Bacchus, der zu ihr kommt.
Oh
ich bitten darf.
Ich soll mit einem stehen, oder
Sei barmherzig, bin ich nicht ihr alter Lehrer.
jagen Sie mir die Kreatur vor dem Mädel, oder ich weiß nicht, was ich tue.
Hätte ich eine bessere Gelegenheit, als auf der Bühne ihr zu zeigen, nicht unermesslicher Abstand zwischen ihnen befestigt ist.
Abstand? Eine Welt, hoffe ich.
Liegen Sie diese Welt in jede Gedärme, man wird ihnen anbieten zu Füßen sinken.
Seid ihr gut? Ich singe jetzt alles mit anderen Augen, die Tiefen des Wassers sind unermesslich. Mein lieber Freund, es wird manches auf der Welt, das lässt sich nicht sagen. Die Dichter unterlegen, ja, recht gute Worte, recht gute.
The prologue to Ariadne auf Naxos. The compromise has been agreed. The performance of the opera Ariadne auf Naxos will proceed as the master of the house has decreed, with interludes provided by the clowns. And that tremendous round of applause was for Susan Graham for her remarkable performance as the composer. I think even veteran opera goers will be hard put to recall a finer assumption of the role. Irmgard Seyfried in the 1950s here in Vienna, perhaps. The youthful Sena Uranach at Blindborn. Anyway, Miss Graham has scored a huge triumph. You've been listening to Ariadne auf Naxos, the prologue to that opera, in this live relay from the Vienna State Opera presented by Radio 3 as part of the Danube Week. The music is by Richard Strauss, the text by Hugo von Hofmannsthal. Other artists taking their bow now because they don't appear in the opera itself are the major domo, the speaking role, Waldemar Kmentt, the music teacher, Peter Weber, the tenor, Helmut Wildhaber, he was the dancing master, the wigmaker, Ulrich Großrubatscher, the officer, Michael Kurz, and the lackey, Alfred Schramme. And Uta Gruberova is singing the role of Zerbinetta. The conductor is Peter Schneider, and members of the Vienna Philharmonic, led by their senior concertmaster Rainer Kuschel, are in the orchestra pit. As I say, this performance is being broadcast live from the Vienna State Opera House exclusively for Radio 3's Danube Week. Susan Graham taking another bow now. What a tremendous performance she gave. It's a shame in a way the composer doesn't appear in the second act. Well, now for the interval, we'll be staying in Vienna in the company of the man that the Austrian radio and television public revere as their Opernführer, or opera guide. That's Marcel Pravi. Mr. Pravi knows this house, opera house, inside out. He was in charge of planning here for many years, and is equally at home in the world of musical comedy. He's close on 90 years old now. He began his opera-going life in the 1920s, believe it or not. When he was a boy, Richard Strauss was the intendant and Maria Jeritza was the leading singer. Pravi was here when the Opera House reopened in 1955 with Beethoven's Fidelio, and you can hear him now recalling that historical moment when, in conversation with Moore Parker, Marcel Pravi looks back on a lifetime as an opera-goer at the Vienna State Opera.
You know, the opera was bombed, and then the opera played in two exile houses. In the Volksoper, or State Opera, the State Opera in the Volksoper, of which I joined the management in 1955, and in the Theater der Wien. The Theater der Wien, formerly the great house of operetta, that's where the major Johann Strauss, Leha, Kallmann premieres took place, became the #1 exile home, and was tremendously beloved by the Viennese. They loved the Theater der Wien. It was an intimate house. And actually, Theater der Wien was the discovery of Mozart. They started loving Mozart in the Theater der Wien. In the State Opera, Mozart was always #2 after Wagner, after Verdi, after Puccini. Then came Mozart. The Theater der Wien, with the intimate atmosphere, created the love for the intimacy of Mozart.
So it had to do with the size of the house, with the atmosphere in the house. Theater der Wien was ideally suited to Mozart compared to the large
Theater
house
der Wien has
on the
wonderful acoustics. You know, it changed the perspective. It changed the perspective. When I was young, nobody would dream to say that the Barber of Seville shouldn't be in the big house, should be in a small house. Everything was in the big house. In the big house was Götterdämmerung, Elektra, Salome, and the main operettas were in the big house. We had, before the war, we had Fledermaus, Night in Venice, Gypsy Baron, the Opernball, Opera Ball, Boccaccio, Land of Smiles, Giuditta. We had a big, substantial operetta repertoire performed by the major giants of the opera. So the great Wagnerian singers were also singing operetta. Maria Jeritza, Lotte Lehmann, Richard Tauber. They were singing operettas. So now, suddenly, everybody loved the small house, and the small house was also very good for the big operas. If you think of the Theater der Wien and you speak to Viennese opera goers, they chiefly will talk about the Mozart ensemble, about the Mozart singers ensemble. They couldn't travel, they were always present. I mean, Paul Schöffler, Erich Kunz, Irmgard Seyfried, Sena Jurinac, Elisabeth Schwarzkopf, and so on and so on. Then, of course, one waited for the rebuilding of the opera, which the government sponsored very much, and private collection went on all over the world to pay money for the rebuilding. I remember the weirdest things. I remember when the opera house was still destroyed. You know, the destruction was very strange. The outside wasn't very much destroyed. The roof and the inside. The auditorium and the seats and the boxes and the stage. Outside it wasn't so much destroyed. So, and the big staircase was not destroyed. I remember when one wonderful soprano, Maria Cebottari, great star, already in the 30s and then during the war and after, he died from cancer in 1949, I remember. And the funeral services were on the staircase of the bombed-out opera. This I will never forget.
That must have been an extraordinary
extraordinary.
experience.
I will never forget. And then, of course, one waited for the opening of the new house. And the opening of the new house was the date, I think, the 5th of November, 1955. Exuberantly called the Austrian coronation, was not a very big success.
The tickets for the reopening at the State Opera cost 5,000 shillings.
Yeah.
In those days, this was a phenomenal amount. It's double what you'd pay today for the best seats in the Staatsoper.
Yes.
Who paid it? Who could afford it in those days?
You don't know the Austrian miracle. There is an Austrian miracle. The Austrian miracle is they can afford it if it has to be. Of course, there were many people came from abroad, but still, I think one half were Austrian. The Austrians can afford it if they feel they have to afford it. It's one of the Austrian miracles.
But it must have been a very special audience and a unique atmosphere.
Yeah,
that
of course,
night.
and the old stars were sitting there. Lotte Lehmann was there, Alfred Picker, not Maria Geritza. It was like this, you know, Geritza was offended on paper. I was a great friend of Geritza. I lived in her home. To me, the greatest singer of the century. The greatest performer, without any doubt.
What about the house itself? As you said, the entire auditorium had been ruined. It was rebuilt, and even today, when you pass through the wonderful old foyer, the 19th century foyer, you enter an auditorium which looks totally different. It's a contrast, of course, to the original building. What were the differences, and do you feel they were successful?
The difference that it was more beautiful before. You know, opera is a strange world. Opera lovers are strange people. They are not human people. They belong to a special type of beings. They are not animals. They are not human beings. They are opera lovers. So, you know what is essential for a good opera house? The bad seats. The bad seats. Today, what you build today, they are big movie houses, you know, with all these parallel rows, no boxes, everything is in front of the stage. You have to be able to bend your neck and to bend to the right and to have a little bit pain in the back to watch the stage. Also very important, without boxes is an opera house. You have to see your opposite, who is in the other box. Opera is a society affair. In the opera you are with the group. In the movie you are alone. And you have a girlfriend with you, but you're alone. Then you exist the girlfriend in the dark, but certainly not the other people in the movie house. In the movie you come on time, in the opera you come half an hour before, because you have to be with them. So in the new houses, new operas, in my opinion, are not being written, and new opera houses are very seldom built. What we have is good new opera houses. We have Metropolitan Washington, we have Munich, and we have Vienna. Even, you know, in the old Vienna opera we had the so-called Säulensitze, the seats behind the column, where you had actually, like in Salzburg, when you have actually to move around to see anything. You had to move around. So you had to work to see something. The idea that all seats must be good seats is against the sense of the opera.
Obviously, the acoustics are also of equal importance. And how did things work with the new house in terms of the acoustics and the technical side on the stage?
Now let's speak about the acoustics. The acoustics are good. They are better houses. I remember when Leonard Bernstein conducted Fidelio in 1978, and we moved the entire performance with the same cast to the Scala of Milano, and I was sitting in the same place in the center box, which used to be the Emperor's box, who came very seldom, but still it was called the Imperial box in Vienna. The parallel box at La Scala, I heard the same performance, they found the acoustics better at La Scala. The Vienna Opera has good acoustic. It's not the greatest of all acoustics. And there are certain dead holes. One spot is good, one spot is bad. Like in all houses, the best sound is on top. The sound generally goes up, so the sound on the gallery and balcony is by far the best sound the house has to give, in my childhood too. This goes for any house in the world. The worst seats are the expensive seats. With the second row and the orchestra, there's nothing. It's good on the balcony, it's good on the gallery if you like to hear the music at their maximum glory.
Vienna didn't have to wait very long for the appointment of Herbert von Karajan as artistic director to the opera.
Yeah.
His concept was, of course, to present the best possible singers in the world in a particular production. He contracted Vienna to the Scala as well. He produced operas as well as conducted them. Would you say maybe he led the way for this trend?
There are various stages. The pre-Karajan era was the era of the permanently engaged resident members of the house. So the productions were cast with the people who were hired and under contract by the house, sometimes for long periods. In my childhood, they were almost for lifetime. Karajan changed this. This is what we call ensemble theater, to do away with the ensemble theater, and he introduced the free casting from all the great peoples in the world, all the great people in the world. It was a revolution. Karajan was one of the greatest revolutionaries. Today he has the stigma of the conservative, old-fashioned revolutionary Karajan. He introduced not only the original language, formerly everything was sung in German. He introduced the free casting, so we could take people from all the world. There were many things behind this. We had the so-called Spitzengage, maximum fee. We couldn't pay more than the legally established maximum fee. By making the contract with La Scala, which had no maximum fee, the contract meant La Scala would hire the singers for La Scala and Vienna. For so much money, so many performances at La Scala, so many in Vienna. At the end of each month or at the end of the year, there was a mutual accounting. And it led to some abusing. Money went into wrong pockets.
Vienna paid more in the end, and also presumably the wages were taxed abroad to some degree.
The top stars of opera in my youth came rarely to Vienna. I think Caruso had sang 6 or 7 performances in Vienna. Beniamino Gigli sang 6 or 7 performances in Vienna. The top stars of the Karajan and post-Karajan era are here. And there is a movement back to the ensemble theater, especially in Vienna. There's a movement again towards working with the people who are under permanent contract. It doesn't really function. It doesn't really function because people now in the era of the long-playing records of television, they like to hear the people they have on recording at home, they like to see on the stage.
The Vienna Opera is unique in its significance, not just for the Viennese, but for opera lovers worldwide. What really are its differences today, and how would you see its next 50 years, for example?
The Vienna Opera is something very, very special. My very first recollection was in the era when Richard Strauss, in my opinion, the greatest opera composer of this century, was the general manager. And I heard an opera which I don't like at all, Der Barbier von Bagdad by Cornelius. It must have been, Strauss resigned in November, at the end of November 1924. It must have been in the season 23-24. I remember when Pietro Mascagni conducted Cavalleria Rusticana and Pagliacci in November 1924. I remember very vividly. And I remember the Flying Dutchman conducted by Joseph Krips, who became later very famous in the State Opera. Actually, I became an addict and a daily fan in 1900, to the end of 25. I think it was a performance of Meistersinger around, I think on Christmas Day 1925, and I think on the 1st of January, Aida. And from then on I went every day. And when I came home, then I listened to the radio, and
you were
I
opera-struck.
dedicated my life to this, because I don't think there's anything more beautiful, more interesting, more unlearnable than this, because lifetime, a normal lifetime, is not enough to know one aria, because you feel, you believe that you know by heart, La donna immobile, qual più malventoso. But if they ask, wait a moment, what is the oboe playing? At which part is the bassoon coming in? Where is the pizzicato? When is piano? When is pianissimo? When is the crescendo? You see that you know nothing. And a lifetime is not enough to know one aria.
You've spent some 75 years going to the opera. What would you say are the differences today in opera and opera performance?
If you want to love today's operatic world, you must know from the beginning that from the operatic world of my youth, there is nothing left. Once you realize this, you don't hate the world of today, then you appreciate the world of today, but don't expect today the world of my youth. Let me give you a few examples. Number one, the most important thing in my youth was the modern, new, contemporary opera. We were very much interested. You know, all these big composers were alive. We said, listen, in the third box, there's Mr. Puccini. He looks rather bad, maybe he's ill. Conducting is Richard Strauss. Erich Wolfgang Kongold is the next boxer. And we ask ourselves, now Richard Strauss is writing a new opera. In those days, it was intermezzo. Will it be very good? I understand there's a waltz in the opera. Will it be as good as Rosenkavalier? So, the contemporary operas were the center of interest and the big box office. Mozart was empty. But the contemporary operas like Turandot, I witnessed all the premieres of this, like Turandot by Puccini, like Johnny spielt auf bei Kmentt, like Arabella by Richard Strauss. Those were the sellers, the big sellers. Mozart was empty. Everybody was running after the contemporary composers. Nobody was conservative, nobody was backward looking. And I think it would be interesting to say something about the city of Vienna. I lived in Vienna in 1938 and I emigrated in 1939, and believe me, it was not very beautiful those days. And also among the Austrians, believe me, it was not a picnic. So when I make another statement, you can assume that I feel rather objective about this. Vienna was never conservative. Vienna was always ahead of everything else. Vienna was the first city dedicated to Richard Wagner, was the first city where a composer like Gustav Mahler, imagine what it meant in 1897 that the emperor is appointing an actually not very well-known composer like Gustav Mahler, a Jewish, to be the head of the court opera. Incredible. And then came Richard Strauss, then came Herbert von Karajan. Vienna was always ahead. Now, taking so-called modern music, it's very interesting that when you talk, it's a worldwide habit which I most intensely disagree with. To call modern music things which are 100 years old, like Anton von Webern, Arnold Schönberg, they are considered modern composers. Now, if you would make a week of modern composers in 1900, would you include early Donizetti, 100 years ago? Now we talk about those things which belong to the generation of my ancestors, my great-grandmothers, as if they would be modern music. But even then Vienna was ahead, because they were never played. If they were played in Vienna. When I was a child, and those things were new, I heard him every day, Schönberg, Anton von Webern. I sat next to Alban Berg in the concert house, I got an autograph. Vienna was never conservative. Therefore, Vienna loved the contemporary music. Okay, this is out, totally out. The Paris opera is the opera of Paris. Covent Garden is the opera of London, let's say also of Great Britain. Metropolitan Opera is the opera of New York. The Vienna Opera is the Eiffel Tower, not the Paris Opera. It's what the Eiffel Tower is to Paris, and what the Statue of Liberty is to New York, not what the Metropolitan Opera is to New York. It's the first thing people see, people love, people hear, people cherish. And I give you an example. This is the Austrian miracle. They are wonderful performances today all over the world. And you know the same singers sing all over. If you want to hear Placido Domingo, you can go to Covent Garden as well as to Vienna. But the Austrian government subsidizes the theaters, and the Vienna Opera gets a subsidy and the guarantee of in the neighborhood of $150,000 to $200,000 a night. A night. $150,000 to $200,000 a night. Doesn't mean that the government has to pay this because they take the income and so, but still this is the guarantee. Now imagine, there may be a peasant in Tyrol who never goes to Vienna and he never goes to opera. And the subsidy of the opera is being paid from the taxes. Now this man in Tyrol knows he has to pay this from the taxes. No political party would dare to mention on their platform, we want to reduce the subsidy of the opera. They lose the elections. There is no party which dares to advocate the reduction of the subsidy of the opera. This is the Austrian miracle. Doesn't exist in no other country in the world. Already in Germany, they closed the Schiller Theater and some. We would rather close the airport than the opera or the Burgtheater. We would close the airport, no planes, but the opera would go on, the Burgtheater would go on.
Marcel Pravi, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it very much.
The veteran broadcaster, writer and Vienna Opera administrator Marcel Pravi was talking to Moore Parker, and that program was produced by Nicola Barranger. Welcome back to the Vienna State Opera itself now for the second half of Radio 3's live relay of Ariadne auf Naxos, the opera by Richard Strauss and Hugo von Hofmannsthal. And we're making a little bit of broadcasting history tonight, incidentally. This is the first time the BBC has arranged its own transmission from Vienna exclusively for listeners to Radio 3's Danube Week. The setting of the opera suggests the Greek island of the opera's title, Ariadne auf Naxos, but with opera boxes high up to left and right of the stage, from which Zerbinetta, Harlequin and the other clowns look down upon the operatic proceedings. Ariadne has been abandoned by her lover Theseus. Desolate, she now hopes only for death. She is oblivious to the three nymphs attempting to comfort her, and she completely ignores the badinage of the clowns when they in turn seek to break her mood of melancholy. Harlequin is no luckier when he sings her a charming little ballad. Ariadne expresses her despair in a great aria evoking the realm of death to which she expects to be transported any minute now by Hermes, the messenger of the gods. Then the comedians have one last go at winning her over with a riotous song and dance routine, but it's to no avail, and so Zerbinetta takes over on her own, for a woman-to-woman talk, so to speak. In her 12-minute extended aria, she tries to persuade Ariadne to accept her own philosophy, that there are plenty of fish in the sea. But Ariadne is still not to be consoled. The clowns give up on her, and one by one they attempt instead to seduce Zerbinetta. In the end, she slips away with Harlequin, and if vocal attraction is anything to go by, who can blame her? Before the performance, I visited Miss Gruberova in her dressing room, and I asked her whether she identified with the role of Zerbinetta.
Yes, she's like myself. I think she's written for me from Richard Strauss, also from Hofmannsthal, because the words are beautiful, and really music and words is a one big eine große Einheit.
Yes, it's a wonderful togetherness, an ensemble.
Yes, and it's perfectly written for my voice and also for my character, I would say.
You don't mind flirting with young composers?
Perhaps in the time before.
But also one sees in the character there is a serious side, there's an ernst feeling.
Eben das ist ja diese Ambivalenz dieses Charakters.
Ambivalence in the character.
She's a young girl and she's légère, but in the heart she's a really serious person and with deep emotions.
Edita Gruberova, singing the role of Zerbinetta in tonight's performance of Ariadne auf Naxos. There's a change of mood when the three nymphs return to announce the imminent arrival by ship of a radiant young man. It is Bacchus, not the wine-loving Roman god, but the Greek Bacchus, son of Zeus and Semele, fresh from his first amorous encounter with the enchantress Circe, and consequently a little suspicious to begin with of Ariadne. But in his presence, Ariadne's longing for death is transformed into a readiness to yield to love. She urges Bacchus to take her away to another life, which he does in a closing scene of transcendental ecstasy. It's the counterpart of the composer's vision of music, which we heard at the end of the prologue. Just a reminder about the principal singers in tonight's performance, which, just a reminder too, is coming to you live from the Vienna State Opera. Bacchus will be sung by the tenor Janez Lotric, and Harlequin by the young Dutch baritone Geert Smits. The American soprano Deborah Voigt sings Ariadne, and Zerbinetta is the irrepressible Edita Gruberova. The lights have darkened while I was speaking, and so now we're waiting for the conductor of tonight's performance, Peter Schneider. And here he is, the Vienna State Opera Orchestra, many of them members too of the Vienna Philharmonic. Ariadne auf Naxos.
meinen Schatten hin. Und dennoch, etwas zuckt dann auf und tut so weh.
Weder Lust noch Schmerzen abgestorben, auch der Pein, das ist tödlich deinem Herzen. Und so musst du mir nicht sein, musst dich aus dem Dunkel heben, es Augen eine Qual. Es ist alles vergebens, ich fühlt es während des Singens.
Du bist ein ganz verfasst.
Nie hat ein menschliches Wesen mich so gerührt.
Geht es dir mit jeder Frau?
Und dir vielleicht nicht mit jedem Mann.
Es gibt ein Reich, wo alles rein ist. Es hat auch einen Namen.
allzu sehr der Trauer hin. Was immer Böses wieder tut, die Zeit geht und die Spur.
Wir wissen zu achten, der Liebe Leid, doch drüben schlachten, das wolle der Weisen zu achten. Wir wissen zu achten, der Liebe Leid, doch drüben schlachten, das wolle der Weisen.
Sie aufzuhalten,
Gott bescheiden, begleiten, ist hübsche Kind. Es gilt Tanzen, Singen, Augen, von Tränen zu trocknen, ein schönes Auge.
Es trocknet Tränen, ich weinte die Sonne, es trocknet Tränen, Rose, schönes Auge, Tränen, es trocknet ein schönes Auge.
Es gilt Tanzen, Singen, Augen, von Tränen zu trocknen, ein schönes Auge.
Es trocknet Tränen, ich weinte die Sonne, es trocknet Tränen, der Rose.
Diese sich schwingen, tanzen und klingen, wir werden der eine, morgen der andere, der eine, repetieren wir schon.
Es gilt ob Tanzen, ob Singen, Augen, es trocknet Tränen, der Rose. Es gilt ob Tanzen, ob Singen, Augen, es trocknet Tränen, ich weinte die Sonne.
Tanzen und Singen,
Es gilt ob Tanzen, ob Singen,
Diese sich schwingen, tanzen und klingen, wir werden der eine, der andere.
Die Haare geht die Liebe hin, die allzu sehr den Tod.
Oh,
Tremendous applause here in the Vienna State Opera for Edita Gruberova in the role of Zerbinetta. It's a showstopper, and she really has stopped the show here. I don't know how it was for you at home, but it was absolute magic here in the theatre. She had the audience in the palm of her hand. She looks quite fantastic, very demure. Little bonnet rakishly on her head, a parasol, white stockings, little black shoes. she's turned away from the audience as if asking them to stop applauding. Now she turns back, of course. There was a marvellous moment near the end when she took out a powder puff and she timed the arpeggios and all those wonderful grace notes as she actually flicked the powder over her face and then under her chin and all together. But she's a great actress in this kind of role. She's, of course, a great actress in many other roles as well, Gruberova. She made her debut here as long ago as 1970. I wouldn't be so ungallant as to ask exactly how old she is, but she's certainly been on this stage for almost 30 years. In fact, she made her debut here in this role in the opening night of the production back in 1976. So she knows the piece inside out, and she knows how to extract every moment of joy and wit and insouciance from it. Edita Gruberova. How long, I wonder, can this applause go on? Well, I thought it was going to be all over, but another round of applause, as you can hear, and she's gracefully acknowledging the orchestra, and my goodness, aren't they marvellous orchestra too. She blows a kiss, and now I think it really is time to start again.
Die Dame und ich sprechen verschiedene Sprachen.
Es scheint so.
Die Frage, ob sie nicht schließlich lernt, sich in der meinigen auszudrücken.
Wir wollen's abwarten, was wir aber nicht abwarten wollen.
Wer hältst du mich?
Für ein entzückendes Mädchen, dessen Beziehung zu mir dringend eine Überlegung bedürfe.
Das sind 4 Schritte von der Wohnung ab.
Wohnung, es ist eine Höhle.
Das?
Sehr viel, sie hat ein Fenster.
Ich glaube, du wärst wirklich fähig.
Zweifle nicht zur allen.
Zu denken, dass es Frauen gibt, denen nur irgendwann gefällt.
Und zu denken, dass du von oben bis unten eine solche Frau bist.
Wirklich wolltest, dass wir ihnen widerstehen sollten. Warum hast du sie so
Eine Schwäche zu trösten, lass das peinliche Geschäft. Trösten lassen, dass sie weinen, sie hat recht.
Doch ich bin störrisch, gibst du ein gut Gesicht. Ach, ich verlange nicht mehr, freu mich so sehr. Auf dieser Ebene sind gütige Plätze, komm aus den Kühlen, ich weiß Bescheid.
Wär nur ein Wagen, ein Pferdchen nur mein, hätt ich die Kleine mal nur allein. Auf das Ende.
Ich bin nicht störrisch,
Laune im Stille,
hätt ich das Mädchen.
ich wüsste Bescheid.
Ich wüsste Bescheid. Wo ist sie? Wo mag sie sein? Psst, wo ist sie? Wo mag sie sein? Psst, wo ist sie? Wo mag sie sein? Verdammt, Zufall, erkennt mich nicht.
bin ich ein Gott. Schuf mich ein Gott, starb meine Mutter in Flammen dahin. Als sich in Flammen mein Vater ihm zeigte, versagte der Zielsetzung.
Well, isn't that an awesome ending? The audience here still, I think, blown out of their minds by that closing scene of Ariadne auf Naxos by Richard Strauss to a libretto by Hugo von Hofmannsthal, coming to you live from the Vienna State Opera as part of BBC Radio 3's Danube Week. And now tremendous rounds of applause for the cast as they come out to take their bow. Bacchus was sung by Janez, Lotric, and Ariadne by that fine American soprano Deborah Voigt. And with them now the three naiads, Simina Ivan singing naiad, the three nymphs, I mean, of course, the dryad sung by Svetlana Serdar, and Echo sung by Uta Schwabe. And with them the harlequin, the Dutchman, I beg your pardon, he's not from Holland, he's from Romania, the Romanian Marian Pope. The Dutchman, of course, is a different thing altogether. That was Gate Smits, who we heard in the first act. Now the two principals coming out again. Janez Lotric, who's from Slovenia, and Deborah Voigt from Ariadne. Now they're joined by Peter Schneider, the conductor, who's bringing the orchestra of the Vienna State Opera, many of them fine players, of course, from the Vienna Philharmonic, to share in the applause. Harlequin, Marianne Popp, and Zerbinetta, editor Gruberova in the centre, the three nymphs on one side, and the great classical singers Deborah Voigt and Janez Lotric now leaving the stage. That Harlequin has a lovely voice, Marianne Popp, I must say. The other clowns were Scaramiccio, that's sung by Peter Jelosic, Truffaldino, sung by Rudolf Mazzola, and Brigella by Herwig Pecoraro. But now it's the three nymphs we're saluting, Simina Ivan, Svetlana Serdar, and Uta Schwabe. And now the tenor, who has received a bouquet for his troubles, and his laurel wreath looks fine now, however much he may have complained about it in the prologue. The tenor, Bacchus, Janez Lotric from Slovenia. Later on this week, by the way, at the Opera House here, there's a different opera every night. Later on this week, there'll be Herodiad with Agnes Balza and Carmen with Anthony Michaels Moore singing Es Mio. But for the moment, as you can tell, all eyes are on the stage where editor Gruberova is receiving bouquet after bouquet. I can count 7, I think, already. She's picking them all up, smiling to us, waving to us, and receiving tremendous applause for that graceful, winsome, amazingly witty performance she gave as Zerbinetta. Later on the week, there'll also be Marriage of Figaro with Dawn Upshaw as Susanna, something else to look forward to. And Peter Schneider, the conductor, will be back here to conduct Das Rheingold before the end of the week. Such is life at the Vienna State Opera. And now it's Deborah Voigt, elegant, superb voice I thought she was in tonight, singing the role of Ariadne in the opera that bears her name, Ariadne auf Naxos. Applause now for Peter Schneider, one of the regular conductors here at Vienna State Opera. And now the orchestra's all gone, the lights are beginning to go up, and that, I think, is the end of tonight's broadcast. Yes, the lights go up first on the boxes, it's very attractive, and then the chandeliers come to light very slowly, and the chandelier on the roof is now sparkling in all its glory as the cast come out for one more round of applause. This broadcast has come from the Vienna State Opera, and Radio 3's Danube Week will be making its second visit to the opera next Saturday. We'll be in Hungary by then, and it's Verdi's superb middle-period drama, A Masked Ball, Un Ballo in Maschera, featuring a fine cast headed by the new Hungarian superstar soprano Georgina Lukács in the role of Amelia. That'll be opening the season at the State Opera in Budapest, and we'll be making a very rare broadcast live from the stage of the Hungarian State Opera. So I do hope you can join Stephanie Hughes and myself, Humphrey Burton, for that live relay at 6:30 next Saturday. Now, as the applause continues here in the Vienna State Opera, the next programme this evening is continuing Radio 3's Danube Week. In the first part of his week-long journey down the cultural and historical Danube, from its source to the sea, the Hungarian poet George Surtees sets out, as we say goodbye to Edita Gruberova, he sets out to interrogate the river Danube and to drift with its flow. So good night now from Vienna and over to George Surtees.